I'm assuming everyone's a little bit familiar with Stoicism or a little bit familiar with Epictetus. So there's kind of three periods of Stoicism. You have the original Stoicism of like Zeno and Chrysippus. We don't really have any of their writings anymore. We have a middle period of the same kind of issue. And then we have this later period of kind of Roman Stoicism, which is the most famous for two reasons, because we have the most writing from that time and because it was very ethically oriented. And that's Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, and Epictetus. So in terms of where Epictetus situates himself, he was before Marcus Aurelius and was a huge inspiration to kind of Marcus Aurelius's Stoicism. So if you're interested in that, there's a lot of influence there. So he was a slave. He was born into slavery and lived as a slave in Rome. And his master was actually the secretary to Nero. So even though he was a slave, he would have been associated with politics and government, at least peripherally. And also, the worst parts of politics and government in terms of tyranny and injustice in that sense. And then after the reign of Nero, he was granted his freedom, or so I should say before that, as a slave. I mean, slavery was kind of, when we talk about slavery, we often think about it in kind of a North American context. Mm-hmm. But then you had slaves had all kinds of different roles. So in his case, he was educated, and he was allowed to be educated, and he studied under Musonius Rufus in Rome, and that's how he got introduced to Stoicism, and he practiced it personally. And then after the rule of Nero, he was granted his freedom, and he Domitian, who was the next emperor, was one of the next emperors, banned philosophy from Rome, and he left Rome as a philosopher, and he opened up his own school. And he, for the rest of his life, he taught philosophy there to young men. So kind of people would send their children. It was kind of like, this kind of school where you would go if you were typically a younger man in this context, and you would prepare for political life, and you would get a philosophical education, and then you would return home kind of having been improved or hardened by this Stoic philosophy. And so he was the primary educator there.
Can I jump in there for one moment? Because there's a couple of cool things that we can kind of jump on here. So firstly, this idea that he was able to be around like the court of Nero when he was younger, growing up, like that's pretty incredible, right? Like that he was actually able to see that, and how did that influence the stuff that he taught later on? Because from what I understand, it sort of led his teachings in a way of kind of saying we need to have a clean break from what society teaches us is right, because he could clearly see how so much of what society was teaching from the court was so wrong, right?
So I'll try my best to, there's just so much I can go into here, and there's so many different directions. So I'll try my best. So you have kind of Stoicism proper, and then you have Epictetus' specific brand. And so one way of framing this question is like, well, how did his life influence his particular brand of Stoicism? And one thing that he is really focused on is this concept of freedom. And he does this thing when he's teaching students, he calls them slaves. He talks about tyrants in his examples, and he gives pictures like this. And so this is also informed by his slavery, right? So what we get here is we get somebody who really values freedom, but also has kind of a transformed or changed perspective of what freedom is. So for most people, freedom is kind of a political position, like you're a citizen, or it's a financial position, like you have a certain degree of wealth. Or it's even a physical position. You have a body that can move, even though, Epictetus was disabled. He had a leg that did not function. So he didn't have that kind of same physical freedom. So instead of locating freedom in any of those things, he locates freedom in a freedom to not be compelled or controlled by other people in your responses and in your actions. So he'll give an example of a politician who wants to vote a certain way. And the tyrant says, no, you're going to vote how I tell you to. And the politician says, do what you want, like cut off my head if you have to, but I'm gonna do what I think is right, and you're gonna do what you think is right. And if that ends up with me being dead, so be it. But I'm not gonna essentially give up my freedom. I'm not gonna be intimidated by you in that sense. And I would say that picture of this emphasis on freedom and understanding it as a internal relationship to the world, to not be compelled or coerced by either other people threatening you or by your own desires for things, was the innovation. And I would say that would come from his experience both in slavery and seeing tyranny, seeing people do crazy things because they were afraid of being punished, or afraid of, or or were bribed. We're like, so they either are afraid of punishment or are tempted by these rewards.
Yeah, and his whole